Hi, my name is Ellie. Thanks for joining me today. I want to, before I begin today, just give a big shout out to everyone who is watching here, everyone who is subscribed to the channel, who's interested in the channel, who's curious about the channel. You may have been a long-time viewer, you may be an occasional viewer, or you might be brand new. I just wanted to say I'm so glad that you're here and you make it possible for me to continue. So very grateful and very thankful. Welcome to everyone. Okay, so on this channel, I have decided to turn this into a fully research-based channel. And what that means is I don't profess on this channel to be an expert in anything that I'm talking about. But I do believe that there needs to be more people in the world who are kind of scratching the surface of reality and looking at some of the things that don't appear to be related, but looking at them as though there might be correlations or relationships there. And so what I do is I look at the reality that we live in and the games and the manipulations that are taking place around us. And I look at them from lots of different perspectives. So for example, I really love tapping into the ancient world influences, things like prophecy and the human archetypes that have existed since the ancient world, the various warnings that appear for us, and also opportunities that allow humanity to strengthen and become aware and change in positive ways. I also think that looking at potentially unrelated things, say for example being really open-minded about ET and UFO phenomena and looking at it against things like faith or lifting the veil or quantum physics or psychology, all kinds of things, and kind of looking at them together to see whether or not there are relationships there. I also am really interested in new discoveries, so whether it be in cosmology or archaeology and in other sciences, to be able to link those new discoveries to ancient knowledge to see where the clues might be that could help us to resolve or overcome or even just navigate current world dilemmas. And also, I'm not a religious person, but I do like to look at different faith systems and belief systems to be able to see where the messages are there. Because even though sometimes these religions are just there for the purposes of controlling humanity, there are other aspects that ring true as well, because they do seem to have some very interesting, sometimes strong, sometimes subtle messages about how to navigate the world and how to understand ourselves as individuals and as a collective. And of course, I like to see the world get stronger and better and safer. And I do believe that there are tools that we have within us that can make that possible. So I also like to bring into the channel spiritual-based psychology. I'm not saying that I'm an expert in psychology. What I'm saying is that I'm a very good researcher. And so what I do is I go looking for answers from all realms of, expertise, and I bring it together and tell you what I found. And I think that this channel has been able to locate lots of different ways that are very practical and helpful that we can use to be able to strengthen our resolve, feel safer in an uncertain world, raise our awareness, strengthen our sense of compassion, and move forward in really positive, healthy, and soul-led ways. And so that's what I hope to be able to bring to the table. And I'll look at anything that can help me to do good in the world in that way, using the skills of research that I've got and this platform to be able to communicate with you. So that being said, I've had lots of requests recently to focus on one of the Gnostic texts. And I found one that I actually think is very fitting for the current day because it talks all about the ruling elements that control our reality. For those who aren't aware of the previous work that I've done on Gnosticism, I do have a number of videos. The very first one that I did was the Book of Mary. This is the overlooked female disciple of Jesus. And her key message is that there is really only one truth, and it sits within each of us. And everything else that we see around us is just a distraction. It's all basically a lie. And that there's no such thing as sin. There's no such thing as rules. There's nothing like that. Everything else is human construct that is based on what we perceive to be true, which then means that our consciousness is leading us forward. And so it's really important to think about what our consciousness is doing, because what our consciousness is doing and what we focus on is actually going to create our new reality. The second book that I did was the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas was another very interesting gospel, but how it translates in the modern world is that basically that the systems of reality that create structure in this world are based on lies, which means that everything that we are created to conform to, whether it be our taxes and our laws and our education system and our systems of religion and tradition and, whoops, I keep doing that, it's too close. They're all based on something that began as a seed of a lie, and it's kind of morphed from there, and that we need to learn to look beyond it in order to see the reality. I also then did the Gospel of Judas. And Judas is a interesting character because he's supposed to be the traitor to Jesus. But according to the Gospel of Judas, he's more like an E.T. experiencer that then had to be shushed. And so all kinds of layers of blame were placed on top of him to camouflage what he may very well have experienced and witnessed as a person. That one was interesting. Well, actually, they're all interesting in their own way, but that one was kind of a bit unexpected. I looked at the Apocryphon of John, and that is a 3-part series. It talks about the goddess Sophia and the creation of Adam and Eve and the Adam and Eve story. And it also links to other ancient alien stories such as the Anunnaki. And so it's a different kind of witness to ET phenomena, this Apocryphon of John. It's very interesting as well. They all are in their own way. I looked at the poem, the really cryptic poem called Thunder Perfect Mind, which is all about duality and the human condition. It was a beautiful, tragic, and just profound expression of what it means to be a person filled with duality and conflict. And it was a beautiful poem. And I really enjoyed doing that episode. Very mind-bending. It was very difficult to wrap my head around it. But there you go. I looked at Barbelo, who is the first emanation from God and considered by Gnostics to be God's co-creator, who hasn't really received adequate credit. She's also considered to be the mother of all creation. So everything that we see around us has emanated from Barbelo. And then very recently, I did an 8-part series, which I've included in the Gnostic playlist, but it's not actually related to Gnosticism specifically. However, you can see correlations there. I did an 8-part episode of the 7 beasts heads in Revelation or End Times prophecy, looking at them from their ancient societal influences, what the key themes of the society were, how it translates to the 7 dark powers that keep humanity trapped, according to the Gnostics, and also how it's playing out in the current day. That was hard work, and I've had such wonderful feedback from everyone who's watched that series. So thank you very much. It was hard work, and I really needed to open a bottle of wine at the end of that. So for anyone who's interested in going back in time and looking at any of these, I will make sure that the entire playlist for the beast heads is linked in the description, and I will also make sure that the Gnostic playlist is also linked. Today, we are talking about another Gnostic text, and it's called the Hypostasis of the Archons, which very simply means the reality of the rulers. So this is basically talking about a series of beings called the Archons. And according to the Gnostics, the Archons are not actually mythical figures. They're real entities, and they're gatekeepers of reality. They create a sense of illusion in which humanity lives in. And in today's episode, you can actually see what's happening in the background, what made it this way. And it's really interesting. It's a little bit like looking at an ancient political struggle in a way. It's very interesting. So I'm actually looking forward to explaining it to you. In Mary, the message, in the Gospel of Mary, the message is that everything is a lie. Basically, all the rules and the laws and the religion and the sciences and everything, it's all a lie. And the only truth is what sits inside us, and that is the light that actually links to our consciousness, that is all about being interdependent with the rest of the world and being able to collectively and individually create any kind of reality that we want to live in, which is beautiful. And then, of course, in the Apocryphon of John, we've gone through the story of Yaldabaoth, how the goddess Sophia, who is like one of the daughters of God and Barbello, she was a goddess who kind of went out on her own and accidentally kind of created this flawed creature called Yaldabaoth. And Yaldabaoth is a character who is probably going to be named Yahweh in the Old Testament, because he does appear to have very similar, resentful, kind of angry, jealous traits. And in John, we talked about how Adam and Eve were placed into this seemingly Garden of Eden, and they were told to look at that tree of knowledge of good and evil, but you have to stay away from it. So of course they didn't. And then things took place. Well, there's a little bit more of that in today's episode, but I've done a lot of that in detail when it comes to my 3 episodes on the Apocryphon of John. The important thing about the Archons in today's episode is that they have been created by Yaldabaoth. They are kind of the angels, the dark angels that work to support Yaldabaoth, who is also Yahweh, according to the Gnostics in the Old Testament. And Yahweh was very resentful of humanity because there was something about us that was an emanation of perfection that he could not access because he was flawed. And so it was all about his resentment and his envy and his jealousy and this kind of act of revenge that he took to just stamp his foot like a toddler and say, no, I'm going to have it my way. So in Gnosticism, the Archons, there are 7 Archons, and they each represent 7 dark powers that keep humanity trapped. They derive from different societies in the ancient world. There is the Egyptian society that created this element of darkness. And in order to do that, it just cast darkness on the people so that they would be receptive to all of the other darknesses, to allow them to be blind to the truth in a way. There was also the Assyrian society that created an endless stressful environment. And then, of course, the Babylonian society that compensated for the darkness and the oppression by giving us shiny objects that really are meaningless, but things like beauty and gold and money and popularity and things like that, things that never really soothe the soul, but keep us chasing all these shiny little baubles everywhere. And then, of course, we had Medo-Persia, the society of biblical fame that introduced things like rules and laws. And that's a bargaining chip, because we were feeling from the previous 3 societies so upended, as though we had to be fearful of so many things, that in the Medo-Persian society, the promise was given that we can provide you with safety, but you'll have to give up some of your freedom in order to do it. And so that's where very strong structures were put in place, where we would negotiate away our sense of personal sovereignty in order to feel safer and to feel protected. Then there was the ancient Greek society that appears in the Bible, which is the 5th dark force in Gnosticism, or the 5th head of the beast, and that was ancient Greece. And that's where intellectualism and physical perfection and things like that all were given to us as opportunities to climb imaginary staircases towards our awakening, when in fact, and our enlightenment, when in fact, none of those things really achieve enlightenment. Yes, if you are well educated and intellectual and have studied hard and know a lot of stuff, then you become more aware in a way, but it's a different kind of awareness. When we're talking about spiritual enlightenment and this divinity and closeness to our Creator, then it comes from within, and you don't need an education for that. All you need is an openness and a compassion and a sense that we're all interdependent. So Greece kind of took us into the intellectual beauty route, but not in a way that was going to be our spiritual salvation, if you want to look at it in religious ways. And then, of course, all of the previous societies were then systemized by the sixth society, which was Rome, ancient Rome. And this is where Rome looked and said, yeah, you know what, we're going to take the slavery from this one, and entrapment, we're going to take the darkness from this one, we're going to take the shiny distractions from this one and the rules and regulations from that one, and we're going to systemize it so that people are busy in this endless system of distractions that keep them away from their enlightenment. And the longer we can keep them busy, and the more we can keep them busy, the more we can confuse them and have them chasing things that don't matter, and we're going to make it the rule, the law. So if they dissent, we'll just kill them. And that explains, in a way, the hunting down and the persecution of Christians and anyone. It wasn't just Christians, it was anyone that didn't quite conform to the society's framework. The seventh beast head, which is also the seventh dark power that brings us to the next society, which is not named in the Bible, is the current day. And according to the Gnostics, but also comparing the Gnostics to end times revelation, this final civilization, which it is, it's called the final empire, introduces everything, systemizes it like Rome does, but introduces one more factor, and that is this wisdom of anger. And that's where the people begin to understand that they're trapped in a system, and so they retaliate, and they retaliate with anger, but the anger itself is continuing to take them away from their enlightenment. This is something we can kind of feel at the moment in the current world, where people are getting angry and they're just pushing and pushing and resisting and pushing, but it doesn't actually improve anything. And what all of these messages so far seem to indicate is that there is another answer that can change the direction of travel for humanity. And it appears in prophecy, and it appears in Gnosticism, and it appears in the end times kind of revelationary texts, and it appears in all kinds of different faith-based or tribal wisdoms or ancient writings, and that is to kind of stop and pause and think, well, you know, we keep falling for the same thing for centuries and centuries. Hey, why don't we try something different? Why don't we all just kind of realize that we're interdependent and build from that every time I hurt my brother, then I'm actually hurting an aspect of myself, because I'm nothing more than just a fractal of the whole. And so this is what the Archons do. Their whole point is to create counterfeit realities, because they're not bona fide, genuine, origin-based, godlike entities. They're lesser cosmic entities that are flawed, and they're created from a flawed act of creation. So they're unable to achieve perfection, and so they create chaos as a compensation for that. They serve the demiurge, which is the Yahweh, Yaldabaoth character that appears in Gnosticism. And the demiurge was a false god who believed himself to be this supreme primary god, but in fact he wasn't. Yahweh was one of the Elohim, and of course anyone who's been following any of the UFO-based authors or podcasters or YouTubers or thought leaders would recognize that Elohim is a plural word, which means Elohim can't possibly mean God. It would have to mean gods, plural, gods from the sky. Translated into, say, for example, the two Anunnaki brothers, Enlil and Enki, who I've done an episode on as well. The Zechariah Sitchin example. I'm actually now reading Zechariah Sitchin's second book in that trilogy. So I'll tell you all about that when I finish reading the book. But Zechariah Sitchin's interpretation of the ancient Mesopotamian, did I say that right? Anyway, texts, was that Enlil and Enki were the brothers that are also appearing in the Bible as Cain and Abel. That's believed by the Gnostics as well. And that Enlil was the brother who viewed humans as being noisy and unruly and a threat to his divine sense of order. And he was very put off by the fact that they were rapidly multiplying. And he felt very defensive about the humanity's defiance against rules and things. He wanted to make the humans perish in a great flood and just cleanse the earth of all the humans, and then they could start again. But Enki, his brother, is portrayed in the Anunnaki story as being humanity's protector. And he is the one who was responsible for genetically engineering humans to serve the Anunnaki by creating them from a combination of clay and soil and dirt, or soil and clay, along with the DNA of the Anunnaki. But he had a soft spot for humanity, and he decided that he wanted us to stay alive. And so he was the one who defied the orders of Enlil and chose a human being who is translated to be Noah, for example, and warned Noah to build a vessel to survive the flood. These are things that happen in the Zechariah Sitchin interpretation of the Anunnaki. The gods fought amongst themselves. Some of them lived in the sea and some of them lived in the sky, and they were all fighting for some kind of a central purpose. There are so many overlaps, regardless of where you go for that information, that they all seem to be talking about the same event or series of events. They're just looking at them from different cultural or ideological perspectives. Ultimately, it looks as though Yahweh was victorious, and his Archons continue to operate in today's world, according to the Gnostics, and they do that through the art of deception and distortion and control. So in today's text that we're going to be covering, there's a reshaping of the Genesis story of creation. So about humanity's creation, about the creation of the world, and it also introduces this concept of a matrix in which we live, and the Gnostic method about how we pierce the veil. So the Gnostics talk about this matrix, but they don't just stop there. They talk about how humanity can break the spell and actually become sovereign again. Today's Gnostic text that I'm using comes from a website called gnosis.org. I'm not going to put a link in the description because YouTube doesn't like it when I do that. And so, but I'll write it up on the screen, which probably is by now. If you want to go and read this original translation, the translation is by William Barnstone and Marvin Mayer. I tend to always go to the Mayer translations because Marvin Mayer has a wonderful way of translating the Gnostic texts in a really grounded kind of way that's easy to understand, but he also finds a way to include the passion that the original language spoke with. And so I think he does a wonderful balance, and so I always opt for his translations. The first section is called Samael's Sin. And Samael is a word that actually means blind god. So it's an Aramaic word. And Samael, whenever you hear the word Samael in this text, they're actually talking about Yaldabaoth. They're actually talking about Yahweh. So Samael, Yaldabaoth, and Yahweh are all the same figure, according to this text. And this is the accidental and very flawed son of the goddess Sophia. The reason why he turned out flawed is because she didn't ask permission from her co-creator, what we consider to be God, which the Gnostics look at very differently. But you know what? You can always go and look at my previous episodes to understand that better, because it's all very complicated. But instead of doing this in partnership with her counterpart, she created Yaldabaoth / Yahweh / Samael all by herself. And because of that, he ended up deeply flawed. And one of the things that he was blind, but I do believe that blindness, according to the Gnostics, is a form of ignorance. And so they explain this in a very interesting way. This text is all about a messenger that appears from the cosmos at the request of someone in who's writing the answers. And he comes to provide answers to the questions that humanity has. Humanity has been in despair at the difficulties that are being faced by the human race, and the difficulties that are always being faced continually by people. The messenger explains that there isn't really a struggle against humanity taking place, but it's the cosmic rulers and the spiritual forces that are actually fighting amongst themselves, and we are caught in the middle of that. And it's all explained in this text. The messenger says that the leader of these rulers is blind and he's ignorant. He says things like, I am your only God, there is no other God but me, which, as you know, I think is the very first commandment in the Ten Commandments, something along those lines. And that's attributed to Yahweh. So that's why we see links between Yahweh and Samael, this blind god, and Yaldabaoth. And the messenger says in this text that it is the very first lie that was ever spoken. And it was a lie and it was a sin, because the only sins that exist in reality are the lies that we are led to believe. And it's kind of turning everything around. A voice then comes from the higher realm, who I think is the ultimate supreme God. This voice from the higher incorruptible realm corrects Samael, or I'll call him Samael as he appears in this text, and says, you're wrong, Samael. And he refers to him being blind and ignorant, which of course gets Samael angry because, he's blind. And so that means he's ignorant, which means that his thinking is clouded. And he starts to project really dark, angry feelings onto his mother, Sophia. What Sophia does in response to that is she cultivates those dark, angry feelings that her son Samael has created. And she projects them with the help of her other children who are not flawed. And collectively they create a physical world that mirrors the spiritual world. And that's where this term as above, so below kind of originates from. Everything that exists is a mirror of the heavens, according to Gnosticism. And so the spiritual world has been reflected onto the physical world. But then what they do to protect this new mirroring of the spiritual world, which is the world that we live in, is they encase us inside a body of water. Now, I wondered straight away whether this was the primordial waters that science considers in the Big Bang theory to have been kind of the beginning of what created reality. Well, reality was encased within this water. And the reason for that was to prevent the dark forces from being able to access us. It's really beautifully written, actually. To the dark forces, we are projected from this body of water like we're an image, a reflection that you would see if you were looking down into a lake. They can see us, they can crave us, they can look at us all day long, but they can't touch us, because as soon as you touch the water, the image disappears. And that's what Sophia and her perfect children did to protect the reality that had been thrown at them by the flawed son Samael, the blind god. The rulers wanted to get into that lower world, and so they thought that they could create humans in their own likeness to be able to retaliate against not being able to access that lower world reality. And so they created Adam, and they created Adam out of soil because they were only a soul, and so they could only create him as a soul. Now, can you tell the language is really interesting, because they created Adam out of soil, which is only soul. And this is something that sounds like it's a bit of a coincidence, but actually it's not. What it demonstrates is a principle of reality that isn't often considered. And I found it really interesting. Everything exists within the soul. Animal, vegetable, and mineral all have soul, but only animal and vegetable have spirit. And we know this because humans can interact, animals can interact, plants can interact. Trees, for example, communicate with each other through their root system, but rocks can't communicate. Rocks are made of soil. They have soul, but they don't have spirit. Little things like that just blow my mind, because it makes me think that even language is formed around these elements of truth that often go undetected. So when these dark forces, these imperfect rulers, the Archons, created Adam out of soil, because he was only made of the soul and he didn't have any spirit, he was lifeless, and so they couldn't even get him to stand up. And it was Sophia who breathed life into Adam. And what she did was she breathed life into him by giving him spirit. The rulers then made him ignorant because they wanted him to serve their purposes. The way that the text describes it is they say they gave him a deep sleep, or they put him into a deep sleep. This was actually making him ignorant so that he wouldn't be aware of the knowledge of the gods. And they also created Eve as well from Adam, but once again she was only made of soul. She couldn't animate until life was breathed into her. And so it was Sophia who breathed life into Eve as well. And the life that she breathed into Eve in the text that I'm reading today was referred to as Zoe. So when you see the word Zoe, that Zoe means the breath of spirit. So the rulers created a counterfeit Garden of Eden that looked like the spiritual reality of the real Garden of Eden. It was counterfeit, it wasn't real, and they put Adam and Eve into that garden. And of course they needed them to be ignorant, and so because they had created an image of something that was exactly the same as the spiritual world, there was a tree of knowledge of good and evil that existed in that garden, but they said to Adam and Eve that they weren't allowed to touch it or look at it or eat anything from it and things like that. And so they were sent to that counterfeit garden, but of course it wasn't real. It was a false reality, because that's all that these blind rulers could actually, or these Archons could actually create. And Sophia tried to help these Adam and Eve. And so what she did was she sent a serpent to help them. And this appears in a lot of detail in the Apocryphon of John episodes that I did. But basically, it ends with the rulers sending Adam and Eve off to live a life of continuous distractions and hard work, to compensate and to keep them busy so that they never get to really see the truth that's all around them. And Eve gives birth to Cain and Abel, and I also explain what happens with Cain and Abel from the Gnostic perspective, I think in part 3 of my series on the Apocryphon of John. And then, of course, the flood story exists as well, which is one where the Archons create a flood to wipe out humanity and purify the earth. And they keep trying to create purity in flawed ways. So they're just not capable of doing it. One of the Archons, they all want to kill humanity, but one of them wants to save them. That's where it overlaps with the Anunnaki story. Noah is engaged and he builds an ark. There's a thing, though, that doesn't exist in the Bible or in the Anunnaki story when it comes to this Noah and the ark element. And I found it really interesting. It appears in this Gnostic text that we're looking at today. There is a goddess Nerea who appears in this text, and she tries to board the ark. She wants to communicate with Noah, but Noah won't let her in because he's been given strict instructions from Yahweh / Samael, who is Elileth. And Nerea is the daughter of Adam and Eve, but she is perfect because she was created with spirit by Eve, who was also perfect once she had spirit breathed into her by Sophia. Now, when Noah won't let Nerea embark onto the ark, she retaliates by burning the ark with a fiery breath. And Noah has to start all over again, and he has to build a second ark because he is obeying Yahweh. He's obeying Elileth. And it took me a while to figure out what was this all about. As I was reading this Gnostic text. But I finally did figure it out. It's actually part of the distraction. And it's a very interesting little component that kind of comes out of nowhere. In the Bible, the flood story is portrayed to be a story where God he's so disappointed in humanity because we're so flawed that he decides to wipe us out, with the exception of those who are truly faithful, like Noah and his wife. And he washes the earth clean with this massive flood. And the way that it's framed is that he's saving humanity so that only the pure can survive and they can repopulate the earth. But if you look more closely, it's a story about humanity is expected to believe that we're being saved. It's part of the distraction. And that's what this Gnostic text, the reality of the rulers, actually says. The whole flood scene is a game. And it's a game to convince us, or to convince humanity, that we should be saved by the terms that were set by a lower, kind of blind and false God. So he is not a perfect God. He shouldn't be telling humanity what to do, but he's created this game where he says, I am your only God. You've got to do what I say. And it explains so much about why the Old Testament in particular doesn't make any sense. The true God in Gnosticism is a much higher being, and there was no flood. That's the thing. The reason why we believe that there's a flood is because we live in a counterfeit reality in which we're constantly being told what's real, and it seems real because we allow ourselves to believe that it's real. All of the calamities of the world, according to this text, are distractions from the pure divine sense of being. And so for as long as we can suffer, we will suffer. And Nerea, the goddess Nerea, who was the daughter of Adam and Eve, she was pure and she was a divine human because she was the daughter of Eve, who was also pure. Once the breath of Sophia and that breath of life that gave her spirit was given to her. Nerea was coming to tell Noah not to be afraid of the flood, because if he stopped being afraid, then the flood would never come. That is a really important message, and it just appears in this text. And it took me ages to figure out, what is she doing? She's supposed to be some kind of perfect God. Why is she burning the ark that's supposed to be saving humanity? Well, that was it. The ark was a distraction, or the flood was a distraction. There was no flood. But for as long as Noah believed that there was a flood, he had to build an ark and obey his God. And if he believed it, then he manifested it and it became true in his reality. Wow, that's kind of a big deal. So Nerea burnt down the ark as a kind of an act of defiance. And she was saying something along the lines of, I'm never going to play by the rules of a distraction of a false god. That's what she was doing. She was pure, and so she could see the truth. But Noah was following the instructions of a very flawed God Yahweh. So he built a second ark, and it was all a bit of a distraction. And then, of course, what it did was it created a snowball effect where this flood wiped out humanity in the perception of those that existed and created a new world that was based on the lies that had been created as a distraction by the false god. And everything that happened from there emanated from there. These flawed gods and their Archons are the forces of distraction that can see us, that can see our responses, that can distract us. They can corrupt us with all of the different dark forces that exist in the previous societies that have now been systemized. They can give us manipulations that convince us to think a certain way and to get angry or to act but they cannot actually touch us. We are never in danger of these dark forces. The only danger that exists in our mind. And that's the reason why there's always so much opportunity to fear things, because the fear is the method by which they get inside our brains. So long as we don't fear our reality, then there's nothing that can touch us. And the closer we become to the divinity that is ours, and the more whole we become. It's a really profound text. I was looking to see what it kind of links to and confirms with that I could talk about today. So I've got a couple of notes here. It does confirm a few things that I've obviously found really interesting because I'm a bit of a geek. Firstly, the difference between animal, vegetable, and mineral is really quite profound. It shows that everything that exists, whether it's animal, vegetable, or mineral in nature, is part of the wider soul, the collective soul. But unlike animal and vegetable that have spirit, mineral only has soul, and it's all made of soil. And that could be the reason why soil is called soil, because the language as it's evolved has always come from, it always derives from an ancient originating place. And I just found that to be quite a profound sort of coincidence that soil and soul are so similar sounding. But by itself, it doesn't mean a tremendous amount. It's just sort of a weird little coinky-dink. But this text also expressly states how Samael, who is also known as Yahweh, had 7 Archons that were rulers working beneath him. And there are also 7 dark forces that the Gospel of Mary claims keep humanity trapped from ascension, and that appears in the Book of Mary. And there are also 7 heads of the beast that appear in Revelation, and they are based on the 7 dark influences that are defined by the 7 key societies that are symbolized in the Bible. Now, obviously, Egypt had good things about it and bad things about it, and so did Assyria and things like that, and Rome. And I did actually have someone comment after I finished this series saying that it was wrong of me just to talk about the negativity of the societies. And I guess in a way, I could have been inclusive about all the positive things as well. But that wasn't the purpose of the episodes. The series that I did was about talking about the 7 heads of the beast that appear in Revelation and how we can interpret them as warnings, prophetic warnings, but also opportunities that exist from the past. And also I was able to kind of accidentally through the research recognize that there's a relationship there between those 7 heads of the beast, the 7 Archons, and the deadly dark forces that the Gnostics talk about as well. And of course, the way that all of those dark forces are culminating into the current energy that we can feel around us. And it was really an uncanny kind of experimentation and an uncanny amount of information that I got. So if you're interested in catching up on all of that and you've got nothing to do one weekend or something, you can binge watch all of those episodes. The flood myth that appears in Bible prophecy, which we see physical evidence of having happened in archaeology. Our physical world, though, is a construct of our consciousness, collectively and individually, and that's exactly what the Gnostics say. So all of the tribal stories about the Great Flood, the physical evidence that we see about the Great Flood, that appears, say, for example, around the pyramid and the Sphinx, that dated at around about 11,000 years ago or something like that. These are all either real things that took place because our reality, our physical reality is exactly what it claims to be, or if you are looking at humanity as being stuck inside some kind of a matrix of some counterfeit construct that we're creating for ourselves, or that we're being manipulated into believing exists, then what the Gnostics are saying is that the flood never happened. It was a method of weaponizing fear. And the fear was injected into Noah, so Noah built an ark, which then created a scenario where humanity appeared to have been wiped out and started again. But in fact, it was a hard reboot of our perception of reality. And so our perception of reality has been created by our sense of this flood being real. It's a bit of a mind bender. Anyone who's read the Bible will sometimes wonder how come Yahweh keeps giving us humans such specific instructions on how to build things. Like, you have to build a temple and it has to be so many cubits and it has to have so many bits of gold and they have to measure this much and they have to weigh this much. And you think, well, what a micromanager Yahweh was. And Yahweh was a micromanager when it came to Noah. He actually gave Noah the exact specifications of how to build the ark, right from one side to the other, exactly what to make it of, even the type of timber to use and everything like that. And what this is the bureaucracy that comes out of Medo-Persia, where Noah had to trade his personal sovereignty to make decisions in order to get the safety from the flood. That was one of the distractions that Yahweh was injecting. And so it always seems to fit together. Whenever you look at these things, there's always so many things that fit together that it just sort of, I don't know about your mind, but it definitely blows my mind. The basic story from this particular Gnostic text is the truth is that the dark forces can't do anything to us. They don't really have any power over us in a physical sense. They can't kill us. They can't keep us alive. They can't make us rich or poor. They can't do anything like that. They can't create wars. They can't do anything. What they can do is they can manipulate our mind. And it's our fear that they can do. They can play with our consciousness. They can play with our fear, emotion. And that's the thing that they use to keep us in line. I don't think that we need to refuse to live in a society or refuse to abide by the law or anything human around us. I think that what this Gnostic text is talking about is that, yes, we can live in the world the way that it's presented to us in a physical sense. We still wake up at 7 a.m. We still take the train to work. We still have or don't have children. We still eat whatever we want to eat for dinner or whatever. We still get married. We fall in love. We go to the movies, all these things. It doesn't matter about that. What matters is what's inside our mind. Maintaining our inner sense of calmness and peace and our sense of serenity. That is where we get our sovereignty, our power as the people. That's where we get it from. And of course, yes, we have to be cautious. We have to look both ways before we cross the road. We can't just walk down the street blindly and say, I believe there are no cars and therefore there are no cars. But I think it's really about how to feel safer. How to feel safer and how to make decisions based on a sense of sovereignty rather than a basis of fear. Now, I have produced an episode which is research-based on how to feel safer. If this is something that you are struggling with, I'm going to leave it as a link in the description for today's show. People who have watched it have said it's really helpful and it's got very practical, grounded steps that can be taken to be able to kind of gain a greater sense of empowerment and personal safety. And so for anyone who'd like to see it, it's available for you. There is another goddess that appears in this Gnostic text, the hypostasis of the Archons. You see there, I've managed to say it. I do prefer to say the reality of the rulers. It's just so much easier. And her name is Elileth. She is a direct emanation from the true God who comes to help to inform humanity of our divine light. And she comes and says in this Gnostic writing to those who've asked for guidance that we should remember that we are, in reality, in our real reality, the truth is that we are untouchable. We're safe because Sophia has immersed us in the body of water that is encased in spirit, and we are filled with spirit, which means nothing can touch us. We can only be deceived from afar. And that happens with the manipulation of our mind. And yes, we are trapped in the darkness into which we're exposed to all the full range of 7 darknesses. But as time goes on, a pure human will always come and visit us to remind us and to reveal the truth. And that pure human has come before a number of times. And the most recent time is believed to be this character called Jesus that appears in the Bible. So Jesus was a human according to this Gnostic text, but he was pure. He was a pure depiction of who we are. And so that purity was his Christ consciousness. And that's the reason why he was Jesus Christ, because he was Jesus the man, but he was pure because of his Christ consciousness. And he came to tell humanity about how we are also pure. It's just that we need to recognize that in order to realize that and to make it manifest in our reality. And for a time he was successful, but then of course, because of how radical he was in his appearance on earth, he was dealt with. And then his time was over. But time will come where there will be others. So there will be other pure humans who come to help us to awaken. And when we do awaken, the text says that we will lift ourselves from the clutches of the Archons. It's another really beautiful text, and all of the Gnostic texts are beautiful. If you haven't read it word for word, it might actually, now that you've seen this episode, be easier to understand, because sometimes it's difficult to understand the Gnostic texts because they are translated from an ancient language. But once you've wrapped your head around it, especially with some of the groundwork that I've done today, it's a beautiful text, and all the Gnostic texts are just as beautiful as each other. So as a closing for today's show, I wanted to leave you with 6 key themes that come from today's text, as it's interpreted by Barnstone and Mayer. The first one is that the Archons world that was created is a construct. In today's world, we could see that as being things like the media, the messaging that we get from the outside world, things like fear-based narratives and algorithms and things all kind of add layers to that. But it could be anything. It could be education. It could be this constant battle of war and things that we're constantly being subjected to on the news, and anything from racial division or othering or anything like that. It's all part of the same shaping of our perception of the world. Because if we believe that we live in a world full of negativity and hate, then we're going to be creating that with our consciousness. The second thing is that spirit is what changes the equation of anything that exists. So Adam and Eve only truly became alive when the higher spirit entered into them by breathing into them. And this modern parallel, I would say, when it comes to this key message, is that our state of mind, things like awareness and clarity and inner truth, they determine whether we live with a reactionary kind of method in someone else's construct, or whether we are consciously creating our own world by recognizing the spirit that exists within us and our power to be able to do so. The third key message from today's text is about this ignorance. Adam and Eve, at first they just accepted the surface appearance of where they were. They believed that they were in the Garden of Eden. And that's the reason why they weren't allowed to partake from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because if they did, then that tree and its fruit would tell them that they're not in the Garden of Eden, they're in a fake, counterfeit space, which is actually a kind of a prison. And so the modern parallel of this message is not to just take for granted everything that you see. Our reality is something that we can build for ourselves, and it can be anything we want it to be. We don't need to settle for what other people have created for us. And of course, the fourth message is knowledge. Knowledge being liberation. The true human that comes to reveal the spirit of truth that's talked about in this text breaks the hold that the rulers and dark forces have on humanity. In the modern parallel, when we shift our mindset from fear and being passive recipients of whatever is around us, and we use our discernment and allow our awareness to expand, we begin to dismantle the influence of all of this false narrative that's constantly infiltrating our lives. The fifth key message I would say is that reality follows perception. So in the text, the incorruptible realm and the Archons both create worlds that are like a pattern according to their own nature. In the modern parallel, we can create our own kind of world. Our reality is formed from our perception. If we perceive that the world is essentially good, it will be essentially good. If we perceive that the world is just, there's no hope for us, then there will be no hope for us. And so consciousness is really important. In fact, all of these key messages, as you can see, they're all different ways of describing the power that we have as individuals. And that is the final key message, really, that appears in this text. And that is that we're described as the children of light that live deathless among the dying. So the text talks about how it's not that we escape the physical world, because we are physical beings once we're here. But our identity shouldn't be defined by whether we live or die, because we are essentially, we're spiritual beings, and which means we have no death. Even if we see death around us, we are eternal, and we will never really be finished because we've had that spirit breathed into us. So the general modern way of looking at this is that when your mindset is rooted in actual truth, you can live in exactly the same world as everyone else, but you can see it very differently. So when you are looking within yourself for that truth that is part of our divine existence, you don't have to fall for any of the mental or emotional traps that are being thrown at you that define the reality for most people. You can transcend that and realize that nothing will ever touch you, because your truth is that you are without the possibility of death. You are an eternal being. Each of us is an eternal being. We are simply manifesting in these iterations based on the perceptions of our reality. So once again, the Gnostics seem to link the idea of sky gods from the upper realm and earthbound and sea gods from the lower realm. And that links to all of the ancient alien stories and things, which I do think that even though they expressed it in a different way, I do think that the Gnostics were believers in the extraterrestrial or multi-dimensional existence, and that visitation took place, whether it be ETs and aliens or angels or fairies. I don't know what it was, but they used their own language. But I do believe that they were believers in otherworldly existence, similar to the UFO disclosure and ET discussions that are happening today. We just happen to be looking at it from a very modern language base and perspective. But I do think that deep down inside, we're all kind of a little bit Gnostic in that respect. And that is an important thing to take away from all of the Gnostic texts, which makes them far more interesting than just religious kind of scripture of some kind. But the most important thing that I think I take away from this particular text, the hypostasis, oh gosh, I can never really say anything, you know what I mean, the reality of the gods, from the reality of the gods Gnostic texts, is that we are in control of our own perceptions, and our reality changes as soon as our perceptions of the reality have changed. And that is a very powerful option for us. It gives us real opportunity to create something amazing for our future. I'd love to know what you thought of this episode, whether there was anything that resonated with you, whether there was anything that you think I should look at as a next step in this story, and also just anything it stirred up in you. I'd love to know what you think. Please leave a comment and help this community to learn from each other and to enter into really interesting, inclusive dialogue about these fascinating subjects. This is Ellie Dreams Ananda. Welcome to the new world. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams. Bye.